Well, good afternoon, everyone. If you're not swaying and rocking in your chair, then you were muted. That, of course, was Sweet Honey in the Rock, was one of their immortal songs, uh, and chosen, I must say, by Makini Chisolm-Straker, our speaker today. We use different music every week, and I, I just want to say I was thrilled with the song Makini because the first modern documentary ever made on Frederick Douglass used that very song by Sweet Honey in the Rock as its background. Anyway, thank you for choosing that. And thank you to Hira Jaffrey, who set all the technology up for us today. I'm David Blake, director of the Gilder Lehrman Center, and this is another of our GLC at Lunch events. It's a great audience out online today, one of the largest we've had all year, I think. It's a great pleasure to welcome Makini Chisolm-Straker. She's been here actually all of this academic year as our Vincent Argiro Fellow in Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery. Makini has done many things with her career. She's a medical doctor, a physician. She has practiced as a physician all over the world, actually, in Africa, in Caribbean, in South America, in parts of Asia as an emergency room physician. Also has worked as an emergency room physician in New York City. She was just recently, a year ago, a White House fellow in Washington, D.C., in the Office of the Social Security Administration, where she did work of all kinds, disability, justice work, work on racial and gender issues within the government. That's a very distinguished fellowship, the White House Fellows. We wanted her that year too, but we put it off a year and got her to come this year. She is an expert in this issue of trafficking, labor trafficking and sex trafficking, and dealing with the victims of labor and sex trafficking. She has co-authored 2 textbooks on labor and sex trafficking. She's been teaching a course here this spring called Precarity as Policy, a U.S. history of structural inequity. She's a deep interest, and it's what we're going to hear about today, on the potential of structural reparations or reparations for the legacies of slavery in structures of American society, especially in health inequities. Makini, it's been a great pleasure to have you here throughout this year. And we've all been looking forward to this event. I must say, too, she has become now a member of a working group we have going at the Gilder Lehrman Center. It's called the Future of Slavery Studies. And we really are concentrating on a lot of policy questions in the future. And so to speak with us today about reparations and the problem of racialized health disparities, Makini, over to you. There you are.
Hi, thanks. Thank you, David.
You bet.
And thanks to everyone for joining this virtual lunch. Today, I'm speaking to you from the land of the Lenape, also known as the Delaware, who were ultimately forced to migrate to Oklahoma. And in the midst of all the violent conflict across this interconnected globe, after immediate ceasefires, I hope that our discussion here will prove relevant to repairing and building a more joyful, loving world for the 7th generation. First, I want to share that today's date, the 1st of May, marks, also known as May Day, marks 5 years since Yvonne Straker, my grandmother, died. In all of my work, and especially this, I hope that I honor her and my parents, Tambra Chisholm and Howard Straker. Next, I have a few people I need to thank. Luis C. DeBaca and Anna Mae Duane pushed me to apply for this fellowship, and I was skeptical that I would be allowed to focus on my purpose, but they were adamant, and they were also right. So thank you, Lou and Anna Mae. Thank you to David Blight and Michelle Zaks for supporting my interest in relationships and following where those relationships lead, and B, for letting me defer a year to do another fellowship, which bettered my insight into the domestic policies that I'll talk about today. And finally, thank you to the elders and peers and friends and colleagues and writers and policymakers and academicians that shared with me throughout this year to help me develop my thinking and understanding. I want to offer up a special thanks to people who spent time teaching me this year. And at the bottom of this slide, you'll see a link to the spreadsheet of some of the materials that I found particularly instructive. Any errors in the presentation are my own. My goal for our time together is to deepen our conversations and work around reparations and indigenization. Thank you all so very much for honoring me with your presence and your consideration. Now, as David is, of course, very fond of mentioning, I came to the policy and history world a bit unexpectedly, as I am an emergency medicine physician. For the first 17 years of my career, I focused on labor and sex trafficking in the United States and how to mitigate their harm using healthcare and a public health framework. And in that time, it became clear to me that the current quote unquote anti-trafficking movement, and myself at the time, were mainly doing trafficking response work, not systematically preventing exploitation, which would be trafficking prevention. This, combined with my service in the emergency department, made it obvious that health and well-being and the prevention of harm don't happen in emergency departments or hospitals or clinics or clinician offices, no matter how holistic or comprehensive or caring those spaces and those servants are. We mitigate the fallout, and that is critical work, but it must happen in parallel with real prevention, which happens in the domestic policy making and remaking space. In the textbook that I co-edited with Kat Chan, our focus was on historical policies that facilitated trafficking and policy recommendations to repair harms and prevent trafficking continuation. In chapter 10 of that textbook, John Chang and Kim Chang expertly describe and illustrate the concept of structural precarity. They say that the word precarity is useful in evaluating systems of oppression and of care and protection when considering how root causes that predispose populations to risks of exploitation and abuse become institutionalized through definition and practice. They chronicle diverse Asian immigration to the US and legislated Asian experiences here to illustrate racialized precarity. This was largely the premise of our textbook, that precarity or vulnerability has been written into US laws, particularly and especially targeting populations of color. And sometimes this was purposeful, but sometimes it wasn't. Regardless, the impact disproportionately made people of color more vulnerable to exploitation. At this point in writing that textbook, I had not yet conceptualized reparations as a means to resolve continuing harm and structural precarity. I imagined that a nation in which everyone has access to safe housing, green spaces, living wages, quality education, comprehensive evidence-based healthcare, and so on, that was the answer. And in this version of the United States, precarity would be written out of our structures. And I thought that would be trafficking prevention. And of course, that is a crucial component of trafficking prevention, of exploitation eradication, and of building a joyful nation, but skipping steps won't get us there. In early 2022, I went to Cuba, the nation of La Revolución that so many of us hold up as a beacon of possibility. I was there just after Russia had invaded Ukraine and resource shortages had worsened. I witnessed blocks-long queues for bread and milk and fuel and eggs, and I recognized the colored pattern of who has and has not. In my travel log, I wrote, "Big picture, it's not all worked out yet. By 2030, 29% of the Cuban population will be over 60 or older. And there's a stream of young people moving off island, and fewer of them are procreating anyway. They leave to have a meaningful shot at a living wage for comfort in providing for themselves and their families. Those that stay are looking to incorporate and leverage entrepreneurship with socialist governance, or better actualize La Revolución sans the possible oxymoron of controlled capitalism. Cuba and the US are more alike in lived reality than either government admits. All around, remnants of classism flourish, and the living legacy of racism burns bright despite our mythologies. Here is a complex story of a young socialist state's as yet unrequited potential. So I wrote to David and Michelle in my application for this fellowship. Cuba's revolution to a socialist government was meant to eradicate suffering along race-class lines and more generally. But from an outsider and albeit brief view, the revolution seems to have leveled the proverbial playing field without ensuring equitable starting points. Leveling the playing field was the writing out of structural precarity from policies and laws, but equalizing the starting point is the correction of those previous disparities. In Cuba, healthcare access is universal. Everyone is guaranteed housing. Higher education is free to all, and equal pay for the same jobs is the norm. Of course, reality reveals flaws, exceptions, and struggles. But in the current setting of food, water, gasoline, toilet tissue, and other material goods scarcity, more of the people queuing up for the distribution in Havana streets read as Black or mestizo. White Cubans are more likely to have familial wealth, which is allowed to be inherited, providing them more opportunities for living wage acquisition or better living conditions. For example, state-regulated private entrepreneurship is increasing, but it is white Cubans who are more likely to have a home nice enough to rent out as a bed and breakfast, or be able to maintain a 1950s Buick for taxi service, or get approval for some other private enterprise licensure. And where there is disparity, corruption and exploitation are cheerful bedfellows. Which brings us to Sankofa. My friend Quinn Trong drew this Adinkra symbol for the textbook Kat and I put together, and she said I could use it today. Thanks, Quinn. Sankofa is a Twi word from the Akan people in present-day Ghana. It means to go back and get it. It comes from the Akan proverb, "It is not wrong to go back for what you left behind." The bird's feet are forward-facing, indicating forward movement. The head is reaching back to bring the past, knowledge, to the future. The future exists in relationship with the past. Reparations are for our future. So let's dig into the policies that are keeping us from realizing our hoped for but as yet unrequited potential. In writing and editing our textbook, collaborating with other historical and trafficking experts, racialized precarity was apparent as a major contributor to present-day people's risk of being trafficked. So I'd like to pause here, though, and note that this year I started out with an interest in structural reparations for all marginalized people in the US, including all people of color, queer folks, and women. But 10 more months is rather short, as it turns out. And so a lot of work has already been done that explores the policies that have precaritized Black people in the US, because so much has already been done to precaritize Black people. So I decided to start my climb here, where the foundation is already strong. And unsurprisingly, a lot of these policies directly harm other marginalized people too. The historical and present-day policies I proffer as the badges of slavery significantly or meaningfully contribute to the racial wealth gap, especially precaritizing Black people, often irrespective of whether they are descendants of people enslaved in the colonies or what would become the United States. As Jennifer Mason McAward wrote, at the time of this phrase's use by the Supreme Court of the United States in 1866, quote, "Badges of slavery refers to indicators of African Americans' slave or subordinate status," unquote. Since the Civil War in the US, badges of slavery especially referred to Southern state governments' efforts to reimpose the incidence or circumstance of slavery upon the formerly enslaved, or to more generally limit the rights of Blacks. There are multiple instances of SCOTUS judges using this term. In a capitalist nation, wealth is the most important indicator of wealth or potential for well-being. And to be clear, I don't mean the wealth of having a summer home or a private jet. I mean the wealth of being able to get sick, miss work, and stay housed, or being able to repair a damaged roof after a climate event hits your home, or the ability to support your child's access to higher education in a nation where higher education leads to a longer, healthier life, but higher education is not considered a human or even a citizen right. In a capitalist society, not having this kind of wealth means that you live in a perpetually precarious state. In Black Wealth, White Wealth, Oliver and Shapiro explain in very clear detail that the Black-white wealth disparity persists and continues to widen. This disparity endures even when Blacks have a higher income and educational attainment than white peers. Income is what you earn. It pays your day-to-day bills. But wealth is how well or how long you can survive without that steady income. Wealth is what bails you out of a bad situation or lets you weather a storm. Wealth is also what propels you and your offspring forward into more prosperity. When a capitalist nation has centuries of policies that privilege the formerly enslaving group in wealth accumulation and prevents the formerly enslaved group from partaking, that latter group experiences these so-called badges of slavery. Based on my explorations, the three major categories of the Black-white wealth gap are de jure residential segregation, the criminal legal system, and tax law. We don't have time to review each element within these categories, and of course, this figure is not an exhaustive list of policies either. So I'll just highlight some policies in each area to help make my point. So let's start with the category that many people are probably pretty familiar with, and that's residential segregation. You're probably fairly familiar because of late, more attention is being paid in mainstream media to the historical reality of de jure segregation, which is segregation that's created and facilitated by law. So as the US violently and coercively expanded west onto more stolen land, the 1864 Homestead Act gave settlers land for private ownership. 1.6 million successful applicants received 160 acres each. White settlers were the main beneficiaries of this policy, and today 45 million living beneficiaries can trace their intergenerational wealth to familiar receipt of this land. In 1862, the South, of course, was fighting to keep slavery legal, so enslaved Blacks weren't beneficiary acts at this point. But in 1866, the year after the Confederate South lost the war, the Southern Homestead Act was passed. And in this version of the Homestead Act, people could buy land. But many formerly enslaved Blacks, despite having citizenship documents, didn't have birth certificates. And it was only birth certificates that were accepted as proof of identity for land acquisition. So here we have a policy that's not explicitly racist, but it's racist in its outcome. Somehow, by the 1910s, about 210,000 Black people owned land, but because enslaved people were forbidden from being able to read, many formerly enslaved people couldn't write wills to pass down the land that they had acquired. So now we super fast forward to the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, commonly called the GI Bill of Rights. Here again, we have a policy that doesn't have race-based language in it, but it was crafted to purposefully exclude Blacks, especially Blacks in the South. The policymakers did this by requiring the act leave implementation up to the states and disallowing federal quote unquote interference or inclusion enforcement. So the South maintained and implemented its apartheid practices, and the federal government funded them. The GI Bill did a very lot for white veterans in a variety of areas. In fact, it's the widest ranging set of social benefits on one federal initiative ever. Young white veterans with little to no savings at all could come home and buy homes in unprecedented numbers because of the GI Bill. For example, in 1936 in California, the VA only guaranteed 6% of home mortgages. Due to the GI Bill, by 1950, 50% of California mortgages were VA-backed. Home ownership, as many of you may be familiar, is a critical component of the story of the Black-white wealth gap because with retirement plans, it is the major component of middle-class wealth here. Home ownership actually became a federal project in 1917 because the communist revolution in Russia concerned the US government. The Wilson administration hoped that by promoting home ownership, US citizens would become more invested in and loyal to capitalism. All of their promotional material featured white nuclear families. But strides in white homeownership were actually more significantly achieved via affirmative action with the advent of the Federal Housing Administration in 1934. Likely folks are reasonably familiar with the federal strategy of redlining or marking areas where Blacks lived as too risky to back mortgages, so I won't go into too much detail here. But simply put, with federal effort, encouragement, and support, already integrated neighborhoods were segregated and existing residential and thus educational segregation was fortified. With VA-backed mortgages and the FHA, home ownership became a main pathway to middle-class acquisition. According to the US Census in 2023, about 66% of people in the US owned their own home. Owning a home is how many people are able to pay for their children's higher education, support other investments, or weather a crisis. But because these policies were designed and implemented to better the lives of whites, most Black people couldn't and still can't partake in this quote-unquote American dream. According to the National Association of Realtors, of home buyers, 88% are white, 3% are Black. I imagine that many of you are also fairly familiar with the success of the US criminal legal system in criminalizing people of color, especially Black people. The origin of our modern criminal legal system is slave patrols. Officers were white military personnel and civilians whose job on slave patrol was to ensure that no enslaved people, that is to say no Black people, were off their site without permission and to put down rebellions against enslavement. So the policing of Black bodies and racial profiling was the birth of local law enforcement in the US. Same, not different, right? But in fact, a lot has changed. Law enforcement is now more organized, it's more embedded in our daily lives, and it has more military capability than ever before. With the 13th Amendment, we finally outlawed slavery, but there was an important exception. Slavery was illegal except as the use of punishment of incarcerated people. The criminalization of poverty and presumed poverty supported white people's continuation of enslavement of Black bodies via convict leasing, similar to the 1850 Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, in which vagrancy of Native people was punishable with forced labor. The vagrancy provisions of the 1850 Act were finally overturned in 1937. The 13th Amendment remains untouched. Then we have the policies that were initiated by the Johnson administration with the wars on poverty and crime, which present lasting mechanisms of policing tied to supposed community building. To be clear, I am not presently critiquing the actions of current individual police officers. Rather, I'm focused on the population level impact of policies of increased surveillance and perpetual punishment. Laws like Johnson's Juvenile Delinquency and Youth Offenses Control Act considered Black youths as, quote, susceptible to delinquency, unquote, installed police in predominantly Black schools to enforce misdemeanor laws, and increased police patrols in predominantly Black neighborhoods. After-school programming and social welfare programming were tied by legislation to law enforcement's engagement in the community. White youth engaged in the same activities as Black youth because adolescents were not considered delinquent, but they were considered troubled. With FDR's successful efforts to increase white home ownership in the 1940s, the following decades saw the blossoming of white suburbs, and urban public housing became increasingly segregated and Black, as more people were increasingly pushed into poor living conditions by federal policies in the midst of having lesser segregated employment and lesser segregated educational opportunities. It was easier to police the Black population, so that by the late 1970s, and despite federal awareness of criminalized behavior in white suburbs, police were installed in predominantly Black housing to allow police to, quote, identify people at risk of committing crimes, unquote. Data on crimes counted arrests, regardless of conviction, and then, of course, arrests increase with more opportunities for police contact. These policies are fueled by the perpetual punishment of people who come into contact with law enforcement. With a criminal record, which includes arrest, even if you're not convicted, many people are locked out of living wage jobs that would allow them to contribute to wealth generation. 80 million people in the US have criminal records, and according to a Pew Charitable Trust study, a formerly incarcerated person will earn $192,000 less than if they had not been incarcerated. According to a report published by the Center for Economic and Policy Research in 2014, this translated to a $78 to $87 billion loss in national GDP. And according to the Sentencing Project, and of course, unless we make some meaningful changes, 1 in 5 Black men born in 2001 are expected to experience incarceration. In comparison, 1 in 17 white men will. It's 1 in 18 Black women and 1 in 111 white women who are expected to experience incarceration. This data probably misgenders trans folks, and we don't yet systematically collect sufficient data on non-binary and genderqueer folks experiencing incarceration. Still, we can see that Black people at the individual and population levels are denied wealth by the criminal legal system. Since the patrols of the 1700s, this system has become more complex and entrenched in Black life via housing, employment, and education, resulting in the theft of billions of dollars from the Black community annually. Next, I'll highlight a couple examples of how tax law disproportionately impoverishes and precaritizes Black folks at the population level. So wages are taxed at higher rates than investments, and the resources of Black people are concentrated in income more than investments. According to the US Treasury, at every income level, white people are able to invest more in stocks, bonds, and mutual funds, and at every income level, the median value of those investments is higher for white people than it is for Black people, or the only other two racialized groups that the Treasury counts. Additionally, the investments of whites at every income level, even those in the bottom 3 income quartiles, are worth more than the investments of Blacks in the highest income group, annually earning $108,000 or more. Whites with less income have more wealth than Blacks. We saw this demonstrated earlier with Oliver and Shapiro's work. This is the consequence of whites having the benefit of intergenerational wealth, which grows over time. These investments that comprise and generate wealth are taxed at a lower rate than earned income. So people who labor for their money pay more for the government to spend. And for all the hubbub that everyone makes about the US being a capitalist nation, we practice socialism, but on the backs of laborers. Black people are taxed more heavily than whites because the wages are taxed at higher rates than investments. That money is used to then fund initiatives like the Federal Housing Administration and the GI Bill, both of which excluded Black people from benefiting from the programming that they paid for. This stands in the face of the false mythology that the US tells its youth, that higher education is the pathway to the middle class. While it is a simple and very logical narrative, it is not the reality for higher ed learners of color, especially Blacks. While it is true that people who graduate from college at the population level live longer and healthier lives, student loan debt to achieve this is no small burden. White college students are more likely to have familial financial support because of family home ownership, the value of those homes, and access to other investments. In comparison, Black college students are more likely to need to take out student loans because intergenerational wealth isn't available to them. And when comparing both groups, Black college students have to take out more in loans. Now, the tax deduction for student loan interest payment is $2,500. In The Whiteness of Wealth, Dr. Dorothy Brown explains that assuming equal terms and best case scenario, Black college students pay on average about $3,071 in interest in the first year of payment for student loan debt. White college grads about $1,622. Because their payments are smaller, that latter group of students can scramble out of debt faster than the former group can crawl out. And the upshot is student loan debt for 35-year-olds with college degrees is estimated to account for 25% of the Black-white wealth gap. Now, if you Google reparations, this definition comes up. Quote, the making of amends for a wrong one has done by paying money to or otherwise helping those who have been wronged, unquote. The purpose of reparations is to repair or to right a relationship. It is a meaningful apology and action to right the wrong so that it doesn't happen again. Most of us were taught this principle on the playground in not so many words, that when you upset a peer by not sharing a toy or a piece of equipment, you were taught to apologize and then wait while your peer had their turn. And then with a new earned trust and a sharing mindset, there was enough for you both. Had the Reconstruction era not been cut short, the financial and structural reparations of that time might have yielded a different and better nation. But executive federal actions, SCOTUS rulings, purposeful efforts of Southern politicians, and the complicity of Northern politicians have brought us here to a wealth gap so wide and with such a complex web of policy that the elimination of the gap needs more than money. This does not mean that financial reparations are not in order, only that they're insufficient now. In 1979, Edwin Dorn said, to say that the current inequality is the result of discrimination against Blacks is to state only half the problem. The other half is discrimination in favor of whites. It follows that merely eliminating discrimination is insufficient. The very direction of bias must be reversed, at least temporarily. If we wish to eliminate substantive inequality, we waste effort when we debate whether some form of special treatment for the disadvantaged group is necessary. What we must debate is how it can be accomplished. So I've offered a few examples of how white people in the US have been and are favored by affirmative action, as Ira Katz-Nielsen has aptly put it. That there are a multitude more examples is a historical fact. The question is not, are structural reparations in order, but rather which policies offer upfront the biggest impact for repair of harm. The 3 categories I've identified as the major contributors to the Black-white wealth gap are where I looked to focus on reparative policies. For example, to counter the over-surveillance and policing of Black bodies that diminish Black communities' ability to generate billions of dollars, police should be removed from public housing and schools and replaced with social workers, licensed clinicians, counselors, mediators, educators, and benefit application support staff. Minimizing police contact with Black people to, at most, the same rates and kinds of contact that people in white neighborhoods have with police begins to disrupt the cycle that LBJ started by linking poverty reduction action with law enforcement. When people are released from jail or prison, their arrest or incarceration history prevents them from accessing independent housing and living wage jobs. The Ban the Box initiative has been gaining ground in multiple jurisdictions, but it should be taken up as federal law beyond the Fair Chance Act. The question should be banned from all housing and employment forms. To counter the current and historical reality of Black property owners paying disproportionately more in property tax than white property owners, the federal government should enact policy like that recommended by Andrew Carl. Since property tax manifestation is a byproduct of historical federal actions, but it's actually within state and local jurisdiction, federal repair requires direct investment in the communities harmed by the current property tax paradigm. In this paradigm, the neighborhoods with the least capacity to raise revenue via property taxes are the most heavily taxed, but still insufficiently funded, such that they experience impoverished schools and crumbling, unsafe infrastructures with not enough green spaces. Federal funds should be directed as reparations directly into public schools serving predominantly Black learners, making sidewalks and roads in Black neighborhoods safe and accessible, developing reliable, accessible, free public transportation in Black neighborhoods, and so on. Federal funds should be infused directly into Black neighborhoods so that Black residents can direct their earned income to wealth generation instead of spending too much money for impoverished living conditions. But along with retirement planning, home ownership is where most middle-income people hold their wealth. So much of the conversation about narrowing the Black-white wealth gap focuses on how to increase Black home ownership and how to improve Black home ownership's capacity for equity generation. But something about land ownership didn't sit right with me. So I wondered about the renter's tax deduction in addition to the mortgage deduction that Professor Brown discusses in The Whiteness of Wealth. Black people are currently more likely to rent than own the home that they live in, but people who pay a mortgage are rewarded, albeit less so after the 2017 tax revisions, but they're rewarded with tax deductions for investing in the capitalism that Woodrow Wilson wanted to protect. By not receiving that same concrete federal token of appreciation amounting to about $29.5 billion in deductions, renters spend 30 to 50% of their monthly income on housing without a wealth boost. Because Black people are disproportionately renters, a tax credit should be provided at least to Black renters because a tax credit is a dollar-for-dollar reduction in taxable income. Such legislation could be enacted in addition to revising home ownership deductions so that only those who live in Black neighborhoods are eligible. But of course, these kinds of reparations are unlikely to be positively interpreted by the Supreme Court, which calls for evidence of discriminatory intent as well as discriminatory outcomes for race-based remedies. Given the Black-white wealth gap, Professor Brown notes that using the area median wealth could be an effective proxy for Black renters' deduction, but pandering to SCOTUS reminds me that if we buy into their rationales or approaches, the court is rigged to prevent meaningful reparations for Blacks. For example, in a recent New York Times article describing the context for the Onondaga taking the US to International Court for Land Theft, journalist Grace Ashford notes SCOTUS's reliance on the doctrine of discovery. Some of you may be familiar, but the doctrine of discovery was comprised of 3 papal decrees written in 1452, 1455, and 1493, which quote unquote authorized colonial actors to take land and subdue non-Christian people in the supposed New World and on the African continent. This so-called doctrine of discovery was invoked in 2005's case of the city of Sherrill versus Oneida Indian Nation of New York. SCOTUS determined that the Oneidas' claim to land they previously lived on was invalid because Christians found it while the Oneidas were living on it. Playground rules would say this is bogus, and so did the Vatican in 1530, 475 years before this particular SCOTUS ruling. In writing for the majority opinion for the court, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said that it's been too long to seek justice now and that land back was too disruptive to current inhabitants. A system that is beholden to a centuries-old constitution written by land-owning and enslaving white men with some admittedly good ideas over evidence, causes, effects, and impacts, just for example, and that actively cite revoked doctrines is one that will, at least sometimes, if not more, support harmful actions, and it has. This is all to say that as I think more about the shape of structural reparations, and especially ones that might contribute to consequentially narrowing the Black-white wealth gap, eliminating the badges of slavery, the more I struggle to see Black liberation or any liberation using this system as it currently exists that did the harm. The purposeful governmental propagation of a dream to create a citizenry loyal to a system that oppresses them makes me hesitant to make such a system more accessible to people that it was designed to keep out. This seems the opposite of liberating, even if, or as it narrows and closes the wealth gap. I considered that the troubling paradigm might be capitalism, because the primary tenet of capitalism is private ownership for the purpose of private profit, and any communal benefit is a byproduct. It's not capitalism's primary goal. But Cuba. So I realized that, like, more than an economic system, I reflected that the drive to own, especially a living thing like land, doesn't resonate with me, but it is the foundation of this nation. Settler colonialism is the foundation of the United States. The settler colonial paradigm centers profit, extraction, and exploitation, and it sees land as ownable and land occupation as a settler right. The settler colonial elite perpetuate and perhaps believe this lie of scarcity to convince us all to participate. This paradigm is how we got into this mess, so accepting repair solely in settler colonial terms poisons the healing. So I began to explore decolonization and indigenization and their relationship to the concept of reparations for Blacks in the US. At their core, decolonization and reparations are both about transforming relationships and getting into right relationship. Depending on manifestation, decolonization is a form of reparation or repair. Decolonization as a metaphor is not an end, but a means. It's a process of change. In Decolonizing Methodologies, Research and Indigenous Peoples, Linda Tuhiwai-Smith offers decolonized reparation methods, many of which I find essential to developing structural reparations for Blacks in the US. For example, Professor Smith recommends intervening to change institutions and systems and practices, not people. Settler colonialism, on the other hand, historically devalues people and centers changing behavior to conform to settler desires. See the Carlisle boarding schools, for example. Professor Smith concurs with a critical reading of domestic policy to examine which groups are precaritized or experience precarity. This would allow us to rewrite policies that privilege the precaritized and plan for systematic policy reevaluation. Conceptualizing structural reparations in Professor Smith's framework, we are reminded that reparations are restorative to Black well-being and they're not about white punishment. We're reminded that reparations is a creation project in which we can imagine more and produce healing solutions, healing for Black people and healing for the white-Black population level relationship. These decolonization principles easily support implementation of structural reparations for Blacks in the US. But when I think about decolonization literally as land back, as sovereignty back to Native nations, it gets more complicated. I'm interested in decolonization because in a system founded and centered on extraction and exploitation, I'm not convinced we will ever all have civil and human rights. I'm interested in decolonization because the settler colonial paradigm is limited. It has actual borders. And it's insufficient for my evolving vision of the seventh generation that centers an attitude and an experience of communal abundance, not a seeking of wealth. Decolonization is meant to upset the system. It's not easy. Of course, important beginnings never are. What I mean to ask is, how can the US government responsibly make structural repair to Blacks by increasing Black ownership of land that the US government didn't have rights to occupy in the first place? Does making such structural reparation further entrench Blacks, who may also be considered settlers here, in settler colonialism? To repay Black people, to improve the well-being of Black people, to repair the white-Black relationship on solely settler colonial terms further precaritizes Native people at a minimum, and it arguably limits us all. To suggest that structural reparations for Blacks can come first and then literal decolonization follows is problematic. It is a dangerously harmful and historically inaccurate hierarchy of victimization. Here, I do not mean to say that Native people are higher on such a hierarchy, rather that such an archetype at all reinforces white supremacy and settler colonialism. Indigenous and Black love, solidarity, and kinship is a long tradition. It has not always been a rosy picture, but we are relatives. And many of us see the joys and the merits of solidarity over division. Alternatively, to decolonize first may trouble the logistics of the US government making structural reparations to Blacks, especially if something like 974 Native nations choose to engage in literal decolonization, such that these lands are again governed by various Native sovereignties. My question then is one of orchestration and coordination. Ideally, I think both structural reparations and indigenization should co-occur, but how? Given that the US wealth is based on admittedly stolen land, what are the concrete actions that in parallel facilitate land rematriation to Native nations and the US government closing the Black-white wealth gap via structural reparations to Black people here? I think, or had been thinking, that the way forward is something like starting with our goals and our values first, and not letting the current US structures limit how we develop methodology to achieve these goals. For example, I think the major goal is eliminating the current disparities between Black and Native people on the one hand and white people on the other with respect to health and well-being, so that population or populations that you're from don't predict whether you die in childbirth or how long or how well you live. And if we aren't locked into settler colonial values such that abundance and community and love of all things, including the earth, are centered, and we structure our actions accordingly, we may well reach such parity without using wealth in a capitalist or settler colonial terms, in which case the Black-white wealth paradigm gap is, that Black-white wealth gap is irrelevant, because closing the gap is only a means to the end of improving Black well-being in a capitalist settler colonial society. Closing the gap is not the goal in and of itself. But we would still need to repair the white-Black relationship, which hasn't been specifically or purposefully righted. Now, in positioning decolonization or indigenization as essential to collective liberation, I've pulled us outside of the expected confines of a conversation about structural reparations, I know. But because I'm being honest about my underlying purposes for reparations, needs must. Without consideration and negotiation of the how in relationship to decolonization, structural reparations ignore the proverbial elephant in the room. This is stolen land. The wealth of the US is the wealth of stolen labor on stolen land. How can we get into right relationship on stolen land? Are the examples of structural reparations that I've discussed reinforcing or validating of a fundamentally flawed and harmful paradigm? These are disquieting, scary questions to me, because I don't believe that Blacks should be prioritized over Natives or vice versa. That has been an effective tool of the settler colonial standard. The more I read and watch and hear, and the more people I listen to this year, the more questions than answers I synthesized. But people, especially in Indian country, are asking these very questions and share my concerns. They're asking because as leaders, at least the leaders that I've heard from so far, they support structural reparations for Blacks in the US. They also know the dangers of perpetuating settler colonialism for another 7 generations on Turtle Island. How can we prevent exploitation using a system structured for extraction and exploitation? To paraphrase Lilla Watson, just as our repressions have been, our liberations are bound up together. So thank you all so much for listening this far. I'd like to have us open up the conversation here so that we can dig a little bit into the discussion about structural reparations to explore what Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang may call an incommensurability with decolonization. The question really is, what do we do now? And what can we imagine together?
Thank you, Makini. Wow, challenging, brilliant. Let me ask a first question or two, and then we've got them coming in over the Q&A and out there. And we have a huge audience online, and we welcome your questions. First of all, thanks for those 3 categories: residential segregation, criminal legal system, and tax law. And I would just like to say that this issue always needs, as you well know, more than morals. It needs a structural approach to structure. And that's what you've given us here. In fact, I stopped counting. There are, dozen, 15, 20 items under each 3 of your categories. If you were to boil down right now, off the top of your head, given those caveats you had toward the end about what can be done here or there, what 2 or 3 items in those lists that you had spread around the screen under residential segregation, criminal legal system, or tax law, or maybe just one of each, would you attack first, if indeed a politics emerges where this kind of serious approach would happen? what would you prioritize? Because there are, it's more than lists, it's categories of all kinds. What might you choose? One in each of the three to tackle first.
The first question, I think, is a good caveat because the problem is they're all so intertwined with each other.
They are.
If we're
But policymakers have to think
right,
strategically, as you know.
so let's just sort of escaping outside of the current political milieu or mayhem, and thinking that things are actually possible.
Sure.
Like, let's do that. Not necessarily that everyone agrees, but just that like we function. We might be able to look at, sorry, I'm going to share a screen again.
Sure.
So I think if we're looking at if we're looking for biggest sort of quote unquote bang for the buck, and where most people hold their wealth, like I said, it's in home ownership.
Right.
Which is sort of why I got sort of stuck there as
which is where inheritance begins too.
How do you own something that you, number one, I don't necessarily think is ownable, but number two, that wasn't even this government's rightfully to own, right? So on the one hand, from a purely logistical perspective, if we're looking at staying within the paradigm of settler colonialism, then it's housing. That being said, you don't solve housing with one policy. So it would still be, because of the way that structures exist now and the current market and economy for home ownership acquisition, it's not what it was 10 years ago. It's not what it was 50 years ago. So while I think that they're all deeply intertwined and it would be highly problematic from a moral perspective, which is really a big part of the point of reparations, in addition to actual literal well-being. I think residential segregation is the attack point.
Okay. Great. I'm looking at all the questions coming in now. There are two, well, I have others too, but let's get to these questions. Here are two kind of together in a sense. Adi Van Dyke and then an anonymous attendee are asking, in her case, in Adi's case, if SCOTUS is so obstructive, the Supreme Court, and you mentioned the intractable problem we have right now with the court, are there low-lying fruit, she asks, that could be initiated right away? And then the anonymous attendee says, are there some examples of structural reparations taking place already in the US and beyond? Are there examples of policies that are making progress? Can we exploit those? So that's kind of two variations on the same question. Are there low-hanging fruit? Are there policies already in place? Are there towns, cities, states, other groups already doing things that seem to be working?
Yeah, so I think low-hanging fruit, easier to potentially accomplish, although still, even excluding the current political milieu, is still difficult, is criminal legal reform.
Okay.
Transformative justice as a goal and changing policy in that respect in some of the ways that I addressed, because you don't necessarily need to make that specifically about race, and arguably I wouldn't even want to, because I think that personally, I think a lot of criminalized behavior is focused on, it actually is about poverty, and or it's about mental illness, and you don't solve either of those problems by using more tax dollars to pay for the housing and warehousing of people. Local changes that have been happening. So number one, a lot of local, like I think it's over 150 jurisdictions now, have some variation of a ban the box initiative. So you sort of see some overlap with those two questions there. You've also seen places like Evanston, we've all heard about, in California, and work that's being done in Washington and Boston starting to take it up, like at a local level around housing in particular, as well as financial reparations, which...
Can you explain that Evanston example or any of the others just for people?
So as an example, Evanston and other jurisdictions are looking, and Evanston has actually been is implementing and has been for a couple of years now. If you can demonstrate that you or your family were victimized by redlining, then you're potentially eligible for funding to help you buy your first home, if you're Black. And I think in that one, I think you actually do have to demonstrate descendancy from enslaved peoples, US, which complicates things. And also, as I said before, I think these policies now are irrespective of whether you are enslaved descendant or not. That being all said, I think the benefit of local law, of local jurisdictions engaging in this is that it's sort of pilot work. It demonstrates, number one, that there is interest, there is support, and that it can be done. And that there are a multitude of ways to do it. And so it lets, on a bigger scale, states, for example, see what might be doable. But this was created by a federal government. The Black-White wealth gap was created by a federal government, and it is the federal government's responsibility, regardless of what the Constitution or SCOTUS think.
Okay, well, that's fascinating, because we do have a question here about the Caribbean plan. Again, this comes from somebody who's declaring themselves anonymous, but is there going to be a reparations plan? Should there be a reparations plan, I think is what this person may be asking, similar to the CARICOM 10-point plan, the Caribbean plan, put together, which demands reparations from European governments, I mean, this is on the biggest scale, the imperial powers of the 17th and 18th centuries. Is it your view that eventually this simply has to be done at the federal level, both in terms of resources and policy making?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for being so direct. But and then that gets everybody thinking about, oh my God, Congress. But let's put that question off for a moment. Let's just, but we can end with that question. Why not? Our friend Peter Ullman also asked about Evanston, but you already answered that. People are asking about how to prioritize all of these possible approaches. I mean, here's one from Gail Billingsley. What is the likelihood of, this gets into politics. I don't know how far you want to go with this. What is the likelihood of our political party system, I'm sorry to be chuckling, to even address this, is what this seems to be asking, whether it's through tax dollars, tax policy, or any other means. I don't know, what are your views on that? Because almost every discussion of reparations ends up here. I didn't want to get there that quickly, but but here we are. How in our messed up political structure can this be addressed? I mean, it can be. I mean, and that's why I think, again, your omnibus lists of all these potential policies, you have to start somewhere. And policymakers can start with 3 ideas in each of your 3 categories and just go for it. But that hasn't happened yet either, not at the federal level. How are we ever going to do that?
So I think 2 things. Number one, I think if we could fund the government for more than a few months at a time, we're on the way. So like until then, I wouldn't get to into the
scary budget moments have to stop.
We have, I wouldn't say we have bigger fish to fry, but like we got to keep the lights on in order to like, you got to keep the lights on in order to do your homework, right? Like we need some sort of fuel to light the candles at least so we can do the work. I think the second thing is something along the lines of what California did, which is putting together a commission, which I don't know necessarily that piecemeal necessarily would work. I think that whatever we do will take generations to see impact, but I think what we would want to do is come up with a group of folks to help determine what things we can attack in what ways, what things, and like set them all out as like, we have to do all of these things. Here is how we will approach it, and an order and a plan for reevaluation, right? Because this is the same problem that happened with affirmative action and SCOTUS, is that in a ruling, someone wrote, 25 years from now, and that time frame was not accurate because we didn't do enough in a lot of other ways to make affirmative action not necessary or relevant. So it has to be basically what we would call in public health a smart plan, right? It has to, you have to make it actually something you can measure, time sensitive, and so forth.
Well, I love your point, because there's a long history. in American political and legislative history, there's a long history of when major enactments do occur, they don't tend to occur as a massive omnibus bill. They just don't. I mean, from back to the Compromise of 1850 to numerous measures, say there's so many examples, the 60s.
But we do have a good example, and that's the GI Bill of Rights, right? That
exactly,
again,
the GI Bill was targeted
programming.
Right.
That's the targets, right?
But discriminatory.
Right. So, but what I'm saying is, it was the widest set of social policies in one federal initiative ever, and it targeted veterans. So now we say, okay, we're targeting Black folks. Here are all the ways. So it's not that it can't be done. It's that it hasn't been done because there hasn't been the will, and there hasn't been the will because there's either, number one, not an understanding that there's actually a need, there's not a belief, and number two, there's a fear of what will happen when people actually live with abundance.
Yeah, and backlash and all that. But I do think your approach to laying out, the statistical analysis of sheer inequity is a very important beginning. For the general public, those statistics have to be kept simple. Can't overwhelm them with this. But it is possible to educate people about this. The GLC's had, as I think you know, it's 4 years old now. We've had this project going under a Mellon grant called The Legacies of Slavery with small colleges. 7 of them were chosen, and each of them had to choose a legacy of slavery. Health inequities is one of them that one of the colleges has done. And they've all been trying to address these things on their own campuses in educational terms, but also in thinking about policy terms. One's focusing on voting rights, another on incarceration, et cetera. And they're learning a great deal about how to address this, in their own communities. In fact, that was one of our requirements. They had to take it off their campuses. They had to take the issue into their community and get real people engaged. So this is a massive question. But here's one other question, and I'll go back to the questions that are still flowing in here. Well, there's one on Du Bois, and I'll certainly get to that. As you've thought about this, which you have now, and you've spent a year within some of the bureaucracies of Washington, D.C., how valuable have you found it, or how valuable do you think it is to look around the world at other systems of repair? I mean, many other countries in very different circumstances for different things have created regimes of repair. Some are about, trading truth for justice. Some have been direct reparation, like Germany had paid to Israel or to Jews. Some have been reparation systems like in Chile for disappeared people, et cetera. So there are many, and India has had a reparation structure, hasn't worked all that well, about untouchables and so on. So the world has been doing this for generations in different places. And at least it's been my view, and there are a lot of scholars out there who've studied this. If we look around, there are models. I mean, if we were to do that, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think, the US has made reparations. It's like absurd to pretend that reparations aren't a thing, right? They've made financial reparations to Japanese interned people and their kids. So it's not that it can't be done. I think importantly, when we look at even the Reconstruction era, it was quote unquote immediately or near closer to the actual issue.
There were plans then for forms of reparation.
Right. You can also look at Germany. I think that's actually probably one of the closest examples to the US in terms of what the country functions like and the targeted group that received it. But you also want to look at Germany, not just in terms of money, but they also did make policy changes in an attempt to not have Holocaust be possible again. But we also then have to look at what the outcome is. We now have created Israel, a settler colonial state, and we are where we are with the genocide of tens of thousands of people. And I think what's important for us to recognize, at least for me, as I was, sort of focusing this year, is that if I stay within the paradigm that exists, it was the paradigm that created the problem. Hence, I think about decolonization and and that relationship to reparations, because I think we have to think differently. As Professor Smith mentions from New Zealand, that it's not enough to just use the terms that have been given to us and forced upon us, but to think about what are our goals? What do we want as a people, as too many people together? 345 million people is just, it's almost unwieldy. But if we think about our goals and what would it take to get there, to me, that is potentially a more useful approach, because working within our system, for some of the reasons that I discussed, there are many others, it's much more likely to flounder, or at least take. So Hillary Beckles a few months ago said that this is the century for reparations. This is the reparation.
And he was very involved in the Caribbean plan.
Yes. So if Professor Beckles is correct, and this is the century for reparations, do we do it now near the beginning of the century, or is the US going to be the last to get on board? I think it does have to do. I think we do need to engage in decolonization, if not as a literal, which is to me the goal, at least as metaphor.
Yeah, but this can't just stop with metaphor, can it?
Well, I mean, some people would argue, yes, some people would say, yes, it's just a metaphor. Let's just do it. We're not actually going to do land and sovereignty back. We're going to. Okay. So that's the decolonization as metaphor, is taking white supremacy out of our paradigms and making education. Education. And I think the argument that Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang make is that it's literal decolonization that we're after, in which case it's at odds with attempting to provide rights within a system that is inherently exploitative.
Do you think sometimes action on these matters actually comes out of crisis? I mean, in the spring and summer of 2020, everyone was talking about the racial reckoning. Everybody was issuing statements on behalf of everything. The George Floyd events, etc., caused a confrontation with many of these issues. But that didn't entirely last, partly because our politics was so poisoned then and since by Trumpism and all that's related to it. But I do wonder, if you think back again through at least modern American history, there have been high commissions, there have been major committees, major task forces on all kinds of issues and questions, like environmental questions, that have existed. Think of the 9/11 Commission. We had to have a report and an explanation of what the hell happened. But there are many other things like that have been done. And out of it have come policies. But there has to be a politics, a will for I don't want to even use the term bipartisan, but for collective thinking about how a society like ours, a massive pluralistic, rich pluralistic society like this, can repair the past. And part of that has to be learning the past.
So the problem with crisis is that when you are acting in a crisis, you are reacting.
That's true.
Traditionally, reaction doesn't last. So George Floyd's murder, and combined with the disproportionate death of Asian American, Native, Black, and Latinx peoples in comparison to white folks, blew up so that there was so much more interest, and people were declaring a public health crisis for racism all over the nation.
Right.
What's the plan? What's the actionable plan? And where's the money, right? So for example, during 2020, we had the height of the COVID pandemic, and ACP was enacted so that people who weren't connected to internet could get it. ACP is running out now because supposedly the crisis is over. So, and because there's no longer interest. And so the problem with trying to build out of crisis is, number one, you need to wait for or cause, which is worse, a crisis. And then number two, you're reacting. And
you can't plan a crisis.
in emergency medicine, when we're training the newbies and someone needs CPR because they're dead, you only get CPR when you're dead. people are rushing around and, like the most experienced person in the room will say, don't just do something, stand there.
Yeah.
Assess the situation, come up with a plan that will last and work. Don't just run around and do something to look like you're doing something, which is basically what happened in 2020. So I think, yes, crisis can be useful, but that's not a way forward. And if now isn't a crisis, when is? We've had so many.
Yeah.
It's just time to get started doing actual work.
Right. And, it's a process of educating people about structures. This is structural inequality. Again, our friend Peter Allman asked, is there a reparations center in the countries that exists to study this? I know of one. It's at NYU. Pablo DeGraff runs it, or he's one of the people who runs it. They do all kinds of work on international comparative reparations, but there may be others. Are you aware of others, centers devoted
I don't know
specifically?
if they use that language. I mean, there are centers focused on the racial wealth gap, which so I guess it depends on how you frame it.
And a lot of human rights centers.
A lot of work is being done around financial reparations in particular, and around housing policy, especially.
Yeah.
There are smaller ventures and organizations and not-for-profits working on reparations for Black people in the US. Yes.
Yeah. Well, there are plenty of other comments and questions here. Well, someone brought up Du Bois and the Souls of Black Folk, that chapter he wrote on the Freedmen's Bureau, and it's a good point that he wrote that first in 1897, and it is an argument for how the Freedmen's Bureau was a fine beginning, but it only lasted 4 years, and it was essentially killed off by Southern resistance and then eventually even government resistance to this idea this fledgling idea then that government should have anything to do with caring for refugee people, former slaves, and so on. This is always part of the American dilemma. Someone also, you don't have to respond.
Well, I mean, David, I would say that in response to that, number one, yes, all of that is true, but it's always, I don't understand, or I do understand. It's let's say problematic is a nice euphemism when we have a problem as a government caring for people who require protection because of what the government has done, but we don't have a problem caring for people who need a tax bailout because their corporation is in trouble, right? The bankruptcy laws, which we didn't talk about, but were on the that I put on the list. They favor the wealthy and corporations, not individuals, who half of individual bankruptcies are due to health reasons, right? It's because people have gone for medical care that they can't afford in a system where there's not universal coverage. So it's only controversial when we're actually going to help people who have been hurt by the government.
Tax policy is by definition structural inequality. Even though, we believe in a graduated tax system, it's not. You're right. In full disclosure, Phil Miller writes in and challenges you, Makini, on calling Israel a settler colonial state. He calls it distant from your topic. You can respond if you want.
I mean, if you want to just Google settler colonial, there are people there. Other people were put there en masse and given political, i.e. border, like political border space, and said, this is your nation. So that is a settler colonial, they're settlers, yeah.
Well, a very contested question these days, to say the least. So I just wanted to make sure that question got in. God, the questions keep coming. There's another one on settler colonialism. Anyway, here's one that it's from Roberta Todd. And I'm extrapolating from her question. A lot of what we're talking about once upon a time within the last 50 years would have been called an urban policy, an anti-poverty policy, etc. All kinds of civil rights policies or results of the civil rights era. Is it necessary? I'm not just going back to the idea of crisis here, but do we need to be experiencing some kind of new history in order for a collective responsibility, which is what this takes, as a society to do this, because there was an impetus that came from a new vision of an American social contract. It began in the New Deal, which was flawed in lots of ways, but started a lot of things. And then in the 1960s, we developed a whole new approach. It didn't entirely last, and there was a terrible counter-revolution against that, as there always is, to the idea of a social contract. And I'm not just saying, you know, let's educate ourselves for another century before any of this happens, but Americans can't even agree on that, whether we should even have a social contract. And I hate to say it, but so much of this comes down to winning elections so that we actually can forge a social contract. Am I right or wrong?
I think that's the short answer, given our time, is it's complicated.
Oh.
Yeah,
You're becoming too much of a historian.
It could be that, I mean, yes, I think we need a New Deal that's not racist. That's the short answer. We need an anti-settler colonial, anti-white supremacist New Deal.
Yeah, yeah, wow. Hey, this is big thinking. I love it. By whatever terms. And I would just say too that, again, repair for the past is an ancient idea. It isn't brand new. It isn't just American. It's been attempted all over the world. It's extremely hard. But again, I really want to acknowledge the fact that you've taken a structural approach to structure. I love that. And would that we even had more time to dig in to these three categories and all the possible responses to them. So with that, I want to thank you, Makini. It's been thrilled to have you here, and you're not gone yet. And you're welcome back here anytime. And in fact, we might find ways to welcome you back. Thanks for doing this presentation. Thanks for preparing it. And thank you, all of you out there, for attending today. It's a huge audience. We're grateful to all of you. Thanks. Oh, and we have another talk. We have one more this term, which is next week, and it's Chris Lettingham. I believe it's a week from today. One last GLC lunch talk. Makini, thanks so much. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Bye.
You bet. Bye, Makini. Thanks.